You were sleeping in the guest room till you apologize. Ava was mocked and humiliated by her billionaire husband Cole Winchester. She felt trapped in a world of control, manipulation, and abuse. She had spent years fulfilling her role as the perfect wife. She had silently endured his subtle disrespect, obeyed his every command, and lived in the shadow of his control. But this time, something inside her shifted. As Cole's arrogance filled the air, Ava's mind began to race, not with guilt, but with a newfound clarity. The walls of her gilded cage, once so secure, began to crumble. That night, as silence descended upon her broken home, Ava made a decision that would change everything. She had tolerated enough, and her next move would make him realize just how deeply his cruelty had cut her heart. What Ava did next made him regret treating her badly. Stay tuned and watch the story unfolds. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel to get more heart-touching stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Ava Collins had always been the picture of poise and grace, the epitome of the perfect wife. Her life with Cole Winchester, a powerful businessman with a commanding presence, had been shaped by years of control, unspoken rules, and a quiet submission to his will. Cole, though charming and successful, had always subtly ruled over their relationship with his expectations. Ava, ever the dutiful wife, had played her part, ensuring that his world was smooth and orderly, always in the background, always performing with a smile. But as time passed, the cracks in their seemingly perfect life began to appear. It wasn't an immediate shift, but rather a slow erosion of Ava's sense of self. She had once been full of ambition, with dreams and aspirations of her own, but they had faded into the background as Cole's needs and desires became her entire focus. She ironed his shirts with meticulous care, brewed his coffee to perfection every morning, and maintained their home as if it were an extension of his own success. She had become a well-oiled machine, a woman who existed only to serve and please her husband. And for years, it had worked, at least on the surface. But then, one evening, the breaking point came. A minor disagreement, one of those trivial arguments that couples sometimes have, became the catalyst for something much bigger. Cole's voice, usually controlled and measured, took on a colder tone. "You're sleeping in the guest room until you say sorry," he declared, his words like a command, not a request. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for Ava to explain herself. It was a decision made, an order she had no choice but to obey. Ava stood frozen for a moment, staring at him. For a second, she considered arguing, challenging him, but she knew the outcome would be the same. She had learned over the years that her voice didn't matter in their home. So, she silently agreed, nodding, retreating to the guest room without protest. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Ava had spent years silencing her own desires, stifling her voice, and living in the shadow of Cole's dominance. That night, alone in the guest room, she realized something she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a woman who had lost herself, and she was done losing. The next morning, as the sunlight filtered through the blinds, Ava heard Cole's footsteps approach. His voice, as usual, was full of authority, but now it felt distant, almost foreign to her. "Have you learned your lesson?" he asked, expecting her apology. But when he stepped into the guest room, expecting to see Ava vulnerable, ready to beg for forgiveness, he found something entirely different. On the small table by the window, neatly placed and waiting for him, were divorce papers. Ava had taken the first step in reclaiming her life. The act was deliberate, calculated, and for the first time in years, it was her decision. The papers, crisp and formal, spoke volumes more than any apology ever could. Cole stood there, frozen for a moment, his eyes widening in disbelief. The words that had once held so much power, his commands, his control, were now meaningless. Ava had taken control of her own fate, and in doing so, she had shattered the foundation of their relationship. For years, Ava had lived in silence, her identity shaped by Cole's dominance. But in that one moment, she had broken free. The weight that had been crushing her for so long lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt like herself again. No longer the obedient wife. No longer the subservient partner. Ava was reclaiming her voice. And with it, she was reclaiming her life. Ava's life continued to follow the exacting rhythm it always had, the cadence of her days dictated by Cole's needs and expectations. The penthouse, a space that should have been hers as much as it was his, now felt like a gilded cage. To the outside world, nothing had changed. She brewed his coffee each morning, with the precise measurements he preferred. 1 heaping scoop of dark roast, a dash of cinnamon, and 2 drops of vanilla. The process had become automatic, a silent act of duty rather than care. Each morning, as the coffee machine hummed, Ava would iron his shirts, ensuring that each crease was pressed just as he liked it. She laid out his vitamins in the silver dish that his mother had given them as a wedding gift, a daily ritual that had once symbolized the harmony in their life. But now, each task felt like a heavy reminder of how far she had drifted from the woman she used to be, the woman she used to aspire to be. She had been the perfect wife for years, making sure everything in their home ran smoothly, ensuring that Cole's life was as comfortable and efficient as possible. But beneath the veneer of calm and compliance, something was shifting inside her. The woman who had silently tolerated being silenced, who had lost herself in the pursuit of pleasing her husband, was beginning to emerge. It was faint at first, like a whisper against the din of her daily routine. But as time passed, the whisper grew louder. One evening, the tension in their relationship reached a boiling point during a formal dinner with Cole's colleagues. The event had been meticulously planned, with Ava in her usual place by Cole's side, always poised, always the gracious hostess. But the moment Sarah entered the room, Ava felt her world shift. Sarah, Cole's assistant, had always been a fixture in their lives, but tonight something about her presence felt different. Her appearance was more than just professional. It was intimate. The way she leaned into Cole when speaking, the soft laughter they shared, the way her hand brushed against his arm, all of it made Ava's stomach churn. It was as if she was witnessing something private, something that should never have been displayed so publicly. Ava remained composed, a calm and collected mask in place. She had perfected the art of silence, of masking her feelings behind a polite smile. But tonight something snapped. She had always kept her thoughts to herself, played the role of the dutiful wife, but this was the breaking point. She could no longer ignore the fact that Cole's flirtations with Sarah weren't just harmless gestures. They were a betrayal. As she watched Sarah lean into Cole once again, a deep, suffocating feeling of invisibility washed over Ava. She was no longer the woman at the center of his world. She had become a mere shadow beside him. A coldness settled in her chest as she carefully observed the subtle touches, the knowing glances, and the unspoken intimacy that passed between them. Do you do that often? Ava's voice cut through the silence, the question sharp and unyielding. The room fell still. Conversations died down, and the air seemed to thicken with the weight of her words. Sarah's hand hovered near Cole's sleeve, and for a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence between them all. Cole's usual smile faltered, and Ava could see a flicker of panic in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with his practiced charm. "It's nothing," he said with a nervous chuckle, brushing off her question as if it were a minor irritation. But Ava knew. She knew exactly what she was seeing, the way he reveled in Sarah's attention, how her presence seemed to fill a space that had once been reserved for Ava. The realization cut deeper than any argument ever could. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Ava. She sat at the table, her face a mask of composure, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the growing realization that her marriage was built on more than just silence. It was built on a lie that she had lived with for too long. She had spent years pretending to be the perfect wife, supporting Cole's career, blending into the background, and sacrificing her own needs in the process. But tonight, she saw the truth for what it was. She had been invisible for far too long. Later that night, back in their penthouse, the silence between Ava and Cole was palpable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that was no longer comfortable or safe. Ava lay in the guest room, not as a punishment, but as an act of defiance. It was the first time in years that she had felt something other than submission. For the first time in ages, she could think freely, without Cole's watchful eyes on her every move. The space felt different, her own space, where she could breathe without the weight of his expectations suffocating her. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, memories of her past began to surface. She thought of her grandmother's desk, a place where she had once written with purpose and passion, before life had been consumed by the demands of her marriage. She thought of the times when she had been a woman with her own dreams, her own desires. And then, she thought of Daniel, the doorman, who had been quietly documenting the things Ava had been too afraid to confront. His notes, the small but significant observations, had been her secret strength, proof that she wasn't as invisible as she had believed. The weight of the evening's events finally settled on Ava, and she knew that change was coming. She had seen enough, felt enough, and, for the first time, she understood that she was not powerless. She was not the woman who had spent years silently enduring. She was the woman who was ready to reclaim her life. That night, the silence of the penthouse felt different. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant buzz of the city outside, were all muted as Ava settled into the guest room. This space, once an uncomfortable symbol of her submission, now became a sanctuary. She had no intention of staying here as a prisoner. Instead, it was her first act of defiance. The walls that had once seemed like a cage now felt like a refuge. For the first time in years, Ava could breathe without the suffocating weight of Cole's presence, without the constant pressure to be what he wanted her to be. Ava lay in the stillness, her mind racing. She replayed the dinner, the look on Cole's face when she confronted him, and the cold touch of betrayal she felt when Sarah leaned into him. The images of Sarah's hand brushing his sleeve and the soft laugh they shared were like daggers lodged in Ava's chest. But she wasn't going to be passive anymore. It was time to take action. The next morning, Ava set to work. She had lived in this penthouse for years, but it was only now that she noticed how much had been hidden in plain sight. She began with Cole's business accounts, those that had once been off-limits to her, but now, with a quiet determination, she began to examine them. It was like a puzzle, the pieces slowly revealing themselves. There were the hotel charges, luxurious stays at five-star resorts she never went to, the flights booked at odd times, and the bills for high-end shopping sprees. But the most telling were the payments made to Sarah's personal fitness instructor. They were conveniently listed as business expenses. Ava's heart pounded as she unearthed these charges, each one a testament to the web of lies Cole had been weaving. Her fingers moved quickly, but deliberately, as she downloaded the statements, printed them out, and began organizing them into neat piles. Ava's stomach twisted as she read through the receipts, each one another confirmation of what she had feared. These weren't just oversights or small mistakes. They were deliberate actions to deceive her, to steal from her. The realization was sobering, but it also ignited something fierce within her. This was no longer about being a dutiful wife. It was about taking back what was hers, her identity, her life, and her freedom. But Ava knew that she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who understood the intricacies of the law, someone who could help her navigate the path she was about to walk. That's when she turned to Claire Winters, the lawyer she had met years ago at a charity event. Ava had never considered hiring Claire, not until now. But she had watched the way Claire handled herself, the calm confidence that radiated from her. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a strategist. And that's exactly what Ava needed. Ava reached out to Claire, and they arranged a meeting in a quiet cafe a few days later. The moment Claire walked in, her presence was commanding. She was impeccably dressed, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room before she turned her attention to Ava. "Let's hear it," Claire said, sliding into the booth with a quiet confidence. Ava laid out the documents, the charges, the receipts, and the overwhelming proof of Cole's betrayal. Claire didn't flinch. She scanned the papers with a practiced eye, her brow furrowing slightly as she processed the information. "These are just the beginning," Claire said after a long pause. "This is good, but we need more. We need to prove intent. We need a clear case of embezzlement and manipulation. This isn't just about money, it's about control." Ava nodded, her resolve hardening. She had lived in Cole's shadow for too long, and now she was finally going to take back control. Together, she and Claire began devising a strategy. They would build a case so airtight that Cole wouldn't be able to wiggle free. As the days passed, Ava continued to gather more evidence with Claire's guidance. They documented every expense, every lie Cole had told, and every action he had taken to undermine her. Ava felt the weight of the years she had spent in the dark, and with each new discovery, she felt a sense of power growing inside her. It wasn't just the financial manipulation. It was the affair with Sarah, the way Cole had used her, controlled her, and discarded her. Ava knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a clear path. With Claire's help, she was building a case that would not only expose Cole for what he was, but also allow her to reclaim her life. She was no longer the passive wife, the obedient woman who catered to Cole's every whim. She was Ava Collins, a woman who had been lost, but was now ready to rise again. In the quiet moments of the day, as she sat alone in the guest room, Ava allowed herself a small smile. The cage was still there, but she could feel the bars starting to bend. She wasn't going to let Cole's lies and manipulation define her anymore. She was taking back everything he had stolen from her, piece by piece, until the last remnants of his control crumbled. The day of reckoning had come. Ava stood in the sleek, sterile office that she had once called home, her fingers brushing the edge of the cold mahogany desk where Cole had ruled over their lives for so long. Her pulse was steady, but her heart raced in a way that felt unfamiliar, a mix of fear and exhilaration, the kind that comes with knowing you've taken control of your destiny. On the desk, she had placed the documents that would change everything. The divorce papers, the forensic reports detailing Cole's financial misconduct, and the damning evidence of his affair with Sarah. These were no longer mere pieces of paper. They were Ava's declaration of independence. She had prepared herself for this moment for weeks, carefully organizing every piece of evidence, ensuring that each document told a story that Cole could no longer control. As she watched Cole stride into the room, his confident air still intact, a flicker of unease danced behind his eyes. He paused as his gaze fell on the documents, his steps faltering ever so slightly. "What's this?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, though Ava could hear the tension underneath. He moved towards the papers, his eyes scanning the text, his expression darkening with every line he read. But it was the divorce papers that hit him hardest. He looked up at her, disbelief painting his face as he asked, "You think you can humiliate me like this?" His voice was thick with anger, his usual arrogance slipping as his control over the situation evaporated. Ava stood taller, her posture unwavering, even though a storm raged inside her. She had waited for this moment, knowing it would come. She had prepared herself for the battle, and now she would not back down. "Not humiliation. Consequence," she replied, her voice steady and measured, each word cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Cole's face turned ashen. His eyes narrowed, searching her face as though trying to find a hint of weakness, some crack in her resolve. But there was none. Ava had come too far, and she would not let him intimidate her anymore. She was done being the dutiful wife, the woman who had silently endured his domination. This time, she was in charge. "What do you think this will accomplish?" he sneered, trying to regain his footing. He stepped forward, his eyes flashing with fury, but Ava did not flinch. She remained planted, calm, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "I think it will accomplish the truth," she said softly, but with such conviction that even Cole couldn't ignore it. "You used me. You used everything we had for your own gain, your own indulgence. This isn't humiliation. This is justice." He was losing his grip, and he knew it. His face twisted in frustration as he scrambled for a defense, but the evidence was undeniable. Every charge on the company's accounts, every trip paid for with their joint funds, every lavish gift he had bought for Sarah. It was all laid out in front of him. Cole turned away from her, pacing the room in agitation. Ava could hear his breath quickening, his thoughts spiraling as the truth continued to settle around him like a heavy fog. "You're making a mistake, Ava," he muttered, his voice strained. "You think you can tear apart everything we've built, everything I've worked for?" But Ava didn't budge. She could feel the years of resentment and frustration slipping away as her clarity and strength took over. "You built nothing on your own," she countered, her voice firm but tinged with a coldness she hadn't known she could muster. "You use people, me, the company, everyone around you, just to stay on top." Her words hit their mark. She saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes, a momentary crack in the armor he had spent years perfecting. But it was too late. He had already exposed himself. Ava wasn't the woman who had blindly followed him anymore. She wasn't the woman who would cry herself to sleep, pretending that everything was fine. She was someone new, someone who had taken control, who had found her voice. As the tension in the room thickened, Ava's phone buzzed. She didn't need to look at it to know who was calling. It was Claire, her lawyer. The plan was already in motion, and the evidence was being sent to the right people. "Your colleagues," she began calmly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke. "The board members will be seeing this soon enough. They'll be getting a copy of everything. The charges, the affair, the financial records." Cole stopped pacing, his back stiffened. "You're making a mistake," he repeated, but this time it was more pleading than angry. Ava could hear the fear in his voice, and for the first time, it felt good to be on the other side of that power dynamic. "I don't think so," Ava said softly, her words filled with quiet certainty. "I'm not the one who's been lying to them all these years." Claire's call came through, confirming that the documents were being shared with the right people. Ava smiled slightly, her lips curling in a way that felt almost foreign to her. "It's over, Cole," she said, her voice a low whisper of finality. Cole stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Ava could see that the man who had once controlled her every move was now floundering, desperate to regain what he had lost. But it was too late. The truth had already been revealed, and there was no going back. As she turned away from him, she felt a surge of power, an exhilarating sense of freedom she had long forgotten. She wasn't a passive observer in her life anymore. She had reclaimed her agency, and she wasn't about to let him take it back. Ava didn't need to say anything more. She had already spoken her truth. It was his turn to face the consequences. The mediation was set, and for the first time in years, Ava felt a surge of control as she entered the conference room. The penthouse, once a gleaming showcase of Cole's dominance, now seemed like a cold and empty shell. The walls that had witnessed countless silent dinners, moments of disregard, and whispered insults now felt hollow and distant. She wasn't just walking into a legal battle. She was walking into the final chapter of a life she had once known, but no longer wanted. She was prepared for this moment. Every document she had collected over the weeks, the receipts, the emails, the recordings, had led to this point. She sat at the table, her back straight, her eyes focused. The weight of the decision was heavy, but it no longer intimidated her. She had done the work, she had built her case, and now it was time to finish what she had started. Cole arrived with his attorney, his usual air of superiority in full display. His tailored suit, immaculately pressed, and his ever-present, confident smile seemed like a facade now. Ava could see the cracks forming. The man who once controlled every facet of her life was now desperately clinging to the remnants of his power. He glanced at Ava with a look that was part anger, part disbelief. He still couldn't quite grasp the reality of what was happening. The mediator, a professional who had seen countless divorces unfold, began the proceedings. The first few hours were spent cataloging the assets, reading through the details of the financial documents. The list was long: artwork, furniture, real estate, jewelry. Items that, to an outsider, might seem trivial, but to Cole, they represented a life he wasn't ready to let go of. Ava, however, had a different perspective. The items were just that, things, possessions that had once held meaning but now represented her entrapment. The family heirlooms, the sculptures, the designer furniture, they were just symbols of the life Cole had imposed on her. With every item on the list, Ava felt a quiet sense of liberation. This wasn't about winning material things. It was about reclaiming herself. When it came to the sentimental items, things took a different turn. Cole fought fiercely for the paintings, the antique jewelry, and the rare collectibles that had once made their home a spectacle of wealth. He argued that these items held sentimental value, that they had meaning beyond their monetary worth. But Ava wasn't swayed. She had kept every email, every note, and every document that proved these items were just his tools of control, not pieces of history or family legacy. She turned to her lawyer, Claire, who had already prepared for this moment. Claire calmly presented the evidence that Cole had long kept hidden. His purchases of luxury gifts for Sarah, his personal shopping sprees under the guise of business expenses, and the shell companies he had used to launder money. Each piece of evidence chipped away at Cole's carefully constructed narrative, leaving him with nothing but excuses. The mediator, sensing the tension rising, called for a short recess. Ava didn't need to step away to gather herself. She had already done the work. She remained composed, her mind clear. Cole, on the other hand, was visibly agitated. His attempts to manipulate the situation, appealing to the mediator, pleading with Ava, were met with unwavering silence. His usual tactic of intimidation no longer held any weight. When the mediation resumed, it became clear that Cole's position was crumbling. Ava's attorney presented the final piece of the puzzle: the financial disclosures, the forensic audits, the irrefutable proof of Cole's betrayal. His attempts to hold onto the penthouse, to keep the luxury cars, and to control the outcome of the settlement were no longer valid. Every move he made was countered by Ava's careful planning. At the end of the day, the mediator laid out the terms, the division of assets, the final dissolution of their marriage, and the restoration of Ava's name. The decree was signed, and with it, Ava felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The penthouse, once a gilded cage, was now a symbol of the past. It was no longer her prison, but Cole's. The final decree restored everything to Ava: her name, her property, and her independence. She no longer had to live in the shadows of Cole's control. She had fought for this moment, and now it was hers. As she walked out of the conference room, she felt a deep sense of relief, but also something more: empowerment. For the first time in years, she felt free. Free from the man who had tried to dictate her every move. Free from the life that had kept her small. Ava Collins was no longer the woman who had silently endured, no longer the wife who had obeyed. She had reclaimed herself, her dignity, and her future. The divorce wasn't just a legal process, it was her reclamation. It was the moment she stepped into the world on her own terms. And for the first time in years, the future looked bright.